Hi, welcome to English 314, Advanced Grammar and Usage, Part 2. Thank you for working through this first iteration of the course with me, and we'll see how it goes. I have a lot of new material to present, and I'm interested in your feedback. So I will probably re-record these lectures when I teach the course again, but perhaps I won't need to. So let's just begin a brief review. This introductory talk is about 10 minutes, and then we'll move on to the first assignment. Please excuse me, I'm a little bit sick. So in Advanced Grammar Part 1, we learned about the parts of speech and the parts of sentences, as I call them, or syntax. So there are 14 pieces of grammar that one needs to know in order to be able to do pretty much anything one wants to do with the English language. That is to say, when one also takes into account the context in which the language is used. So the audience, or the relationship between the audience and the speaker and what's being said. So context always in part dictates how we decide to use the language, what sorts of choices we make, how we perhaps think about how to invert or play around with the grammar, all of which, however, depends on our understanding very well how our language works, how the grammar and the mechanics actually work. If you remember from part 1 of the course, I'm very interested in describing and discovering the ways that the language has changed over time, the way that in practice, small pieces or small ways that we express what we want to say have changed and are different from earlier usages, but that I'm always really kind of fascinated with the way that the grammar really predictably and dependably, the grammatical terms, that is, the description or descriptors we have for assessing and examining what's happening with the language, have really remained pretty consistent over time. So they do a good job, in other words, and remember that this descriptive language, this grammatical language, is really just a way of coming in and trying to give us a way to reflect upon what we're saying and how we're saying it. So it's a really important tool to have in order to work with the language. And some have argued, as you know, that understanding or knowing this, how to use this tool, is simply not enough to be able to work well within one's language, and I think that certainly can be true. That's not enough. We also need to be active users and reflective users of the language. We always do need to pay attention to context and to the relationship between the speaker and those spoken to. That is certainly true. But as in any practice that depends on a sort of base of knowledge and a set of skills, one's always better able to perform within that practice if one does also know the rules, so to speak, or the knowledge that has been amassed over time by people who have studied the matter for a long time, or participated in the practice for a long time. So that being said, you know my approach. You've taken the first section of the course with me, and what part 2 does is extend what we know. It doesn't really add much into what you've already learned in part 1. That is to say, we're building upon or filling in more of the details of the 14 pieces of grammar that you already know quite well, the 8 parts of speech and the 6 parts of sentences or syntax. So we'll be continuing on now, learning more within each of those categories, mostly within the categories of adverbs and conjunctions, which are the 2 really important pieces of speech or parts of speech that help us to link together larger bits of syntax, larger and progressively larger bits of syntax, that is to say, that helps us to connect clauses. So if you remember, in part 1 of the course, we focused for the most part, with a few exceptions, on the construction and analysis of the single clause sentence. We haven't worked very much with 2-clause or multi-clausal sentences. So a clause, if you remember, is an utterance that includes a subject and a predicate. That is typically when we have an independent clause, a clause that can stand on its own, that is called what we call a sentence. That is the basic unit of grammar in English and in really any study of grammar. Grammar is the study of the sentence. Now, the independent clause, the subject and the predicate together that can stand on its own, as in the sentence, Lucy loves eating. Lucy, what subject, loves what eating. Loves eating predicate. In that sentence, that complete independent clause, or with that clause, we can, excuse me, here's my sickness again. That independent clause in much more complicated versions is what we focused on in the first half of this class. Now we'll be adding to that by means of adding adverbs and conjunctions on either end of that clause, multi-clausal sentences, clauses that combine two independent clauses. For example, Lucy loves eating and Sarah loves talking. So two separate clauses, and if you remember the language that I used humorously but also seriously in part 1, we have now not one crucifix or one clause to diagram, but two. So the two clauses are connected by this and, by this conjunction. No need to understand exactly how this works yet. I'm just explaining the direction of the course and the ground that we're going to cover. There's also a way of combining independent clauses with dependent clauses. A dependent clause is still a clause. It is an utterance that includes a subject and a predicate, but it is an utterance including a subject and a predicate, such as Lucy loves eating, that depends on another clause, an independent clause. It needs to be attached to something else. It's dependent. So the way that it attaches itself to another clause is by means, usually, of an adverb of some kind. So I could say something like, because Lucy loves eating, comma, there's our independent clause. You hear that it can't, our dependent clause, you hear that it can't stand on its own. So because Lucy loves eating, let's add something to that is independent now. Because Lucy loves eating, she buys a lot of food. There you go. So she buys a lot of food. There's our independent clause. The dependent clause is because she loves eating. So Lucy loves eating. So it needs to be attached somehow to that independent clause. And the two clauses, both the independent and the dependent, are crucifixes on their own. So we're going to learn now how to connect those two clauses, those two crucifixes, by means of the because. Adverbs and conjunctions both work to connect clauses, and they do so in slightly different ways and important ways. So what we'll begin looking at in the course briefly is the adverb, how the adverb does that. But before we get into how the adverb does that, we will review how adverbs work. And you know that adverbs are the part of speech that describe adverbs, verbs, other adverbs, verbs, adjectives, or whole sentences or whole clauses. So remember that last one, and I'm going to give you some new material that just gives you a little bit more of how adverbs describe whole clauses. We've already done this in part 1, but you'll do a brief review in the first assignment, and then you'll see additionally some ways that adverbs can introduce or connect clauses. Then we'll move on to conjunctions to see how conjunctions can do the same thing, connect clauses, but does so in a slightly different way, or do so in a slightly different way. And after that, we'll jump right into diagramming. So we'll be diagramming progressively more complicated multi-clausal sentences. We will also continue to be adding in phrases of various kinds. So I've added in the first sets of exercises various kinds of phrases for you to review. So we've learned many of them. Most commonly, the prepositional phrase, we see many of those. And if you remember, a phrase is a group of words that acts like one part of speech. So review the terms, the differences between clauses and phrases. A phrase, grammatically speaking, is not just a set of words. It is a group of words that behaves as one part of speech. A clause is not that. A clause is different, as I've just described and as is described in the book. So remember the differences, and we'll be learning about more kinds of phrases and practicing again with phrases we learned at the end of part 1, including, for example, noun phrases, adverbial phrases, adjectival phrases that begin with participles, and so on. So here we go, and I think by the end of this course you'll feel really much more in control of a lot of the nuances of English grammar, and you'll be able to play around a bit more with the language and with more complicated utterances, which don't necessarily always, and in fact aren't necessarily always long utterances. They're just interesting, and we play around with the subtleties. You'll also see more exceptions. We saw a great deal of exceptions in part 1, and even in what seemed to be the most basic utterances. But now we'll see more examples of just kind of what the language can do when we also we pay attention to grammar at this even more precise level, and in a way that forces us to deal even more carefully with the meanings of individual words and how those individual words can change depending on how we actually use them and how they fit into the grammar of sentences. Words have meanings on their own, of course, in certain ways, but they're used within systems of grammar, within language communities, linguistic communities, within different relationships between speaker and listener, and so on. So remember that the language is dynamic and that it's alive, and it doesn't actually exist anywhere except when we use it and in our heads, and that this tool of grammar helps us to explain for ourselves what it is we're trying to do, and perhaps what somebody else might be trying to do with an utterance. So I'm going to sign off now, and then we'll go on to our first assignment.